welcome, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch this. What you're about to see is a gentle examination of daily existence in Pompeii during what appeared to be just another typical day. The emphasis stays on the routines that filled each day, on the surroundings people knew by heart, and on the consistent patterns of labor and domestic life that gave structure to the hours stretching from dawn until darkness fell. The horizon begins to show a narrow ribbon of light, colorless and delicate in those first moments. Above it, the sky holds on to darkness, while the outlines of rooftops and walls start pulling away from the night that surrounded them. Stone surfaces feel cool when touched, having given up the heat they absorbed during the previous day. Through the narrow passages between buildings, the paving stones lie undisturbed, their surfaces carrying a faint dampness in spots where moisture from the night air has gathered. No human voices break the silence yet. The streets remain empty of carts and commerce. For this brief window of time, the city exists in a state suspended between the end of darkness and the beginning of human activity. Movement starts happening inside the dwellings before any sound makes its way outdoors. In the rooms on upper levels, people begin to stir beneath the light fabrics that covered them through the night. Fingers reach for the edges of folded cloth. Slowly, bodies pull themselves upright, making small adjustments as they meet the chill that settled in during the hours before sunrise. The bedding gets lifted up, given a single shake, and then folded into tight bundles before being tucked along the walls or stored inside wooden chests. These movements follow patterns, established through countless repetitions, executed with hardly any noise. Sleep releases its hold immediately, giving way to the alert awareness that comes with the day's responsibilities waiting ahead. In certain rooms, oil lamps continue burning at a low level, their small flames shifting as currents of air pass through the open spaces in the roofs. One after another, these lamps get extinguished by fingers dampened for the purpose, or by covers placed over them to cut off the oxygen. Thin streams of smoke climb upward and dissolve into nothing. The grey illumination filtering down from the central open areas of the houses grows more intense, coming through the roof openings and bouncing off the pale plaster surfaces. Furniture outlines become visible now, along with storage vessels and various tools, all of them clear enough to see without needing the help of flame light. When feet make contact with floors cooled by the night air, there's a momentary hesitation before movement picks up again. Tunics get taken down from their hanging places on pegs or lifted from low stools where they were left. The fabric passes over shoulders and drops into place around the waist. Belts get pulled tight. Hands dampened with water smooth hair back or gather it into loose ties. All of this happens without spoken words passing between people. Each person moves through a sequence made automatic by repetition. guided more by muscle memory than by conscious choice. In the courtyards at the center of homes, the first wooden bolts slide back from their positions. Panels of wood swing inward, making a subdued, scraping sound as they move. Air from outside begins flowing through the interior spaces, bringing with it subtle traces of damp stone and distant ash from cooking fires that never completely died down. Through the open squares in the roofs, above the central water basins, a patch of strengthening light descends. The water sitting in these shallow collecting pools mirrors the brightening sky above, its surface remaining mostly still except for occasional ripples from small drips falling from the roof tiles. A woman makes her way across the courtyard with a small clay lamp in her hands, now cold and dark, setting it down in the area near the hearth. She lowers herself to her knees and begins working through the ashes left behind from the fire that burned the evening before. Under the grey layer on top, heat still lingers. Into this she places dry twigs, along with a handful of straw. Her breath, directed with precision, coaxes out a small glow that builds into a steady burning flame. Smoke climbs straight up through the motionless air before it begins drifting toward the opening in the roof. The smell that comes from the rekindled fire spreads outward through the dwelling, mingling with the odors of stored grain and earthenware. In another part of the same house, a man removes a wooden bar that secured the front door through the night. The panel facing the street opens only part way initially. He stops there, his gaze moving along the dim passageway outside. Finding no one moving past yet, he pushes it open the rest of the way and fixes it in that position. The air from the street flows in, noticeably cooler than what filled the interior. He steps through briefly, his eyes scanning the full length of the lane in both directions, then comes back inside to retrieve a small vessel. On the opposite side of the street, another doorway swings open in much the same manner. A child emerges from it, barefoot and carrying small cup. The cold stone under those bare feet draws a sharp intake of breath, but the walking pace stays unchanged. The child heads toward a public fountain positioned nearby, still caught in shadow, where water pours continuously into a basin worn smooth by years of use. The splash creates soft echoes against the surrounding walls. The cup gets filled to the appropriate level, and then carried back, with careful attention to not spilling. The sound of grinding begins in one household, then spreads to another. Stone pressing against stone creates a low, steady noise. Individual kernels of grain crack apart and break down under the weight of the upper stone being rotated by hands that work without stopping. This rhythm keeps going without any breaks in the pattern. Ground flour accumulates at the rim of the grinding surface, swept aside into a bowl sitting ready. The aroma of crushed grain enters the air, high quality and a hint of sweetness. A minor vibration travels through the ground beneath, light and quick. A cup hanging against the wall trembles slightly, producing a small noise before going still again. No one stops their work long enough to comment on it. The movement gets absorbed into the normal shifts that happen in wood and plaster when temperatures change. Hands keep doing what they were doing. Fires receive more fuel. Water gets transferred from one container to another. The light continues building in strength, shifting from grey tones to pale gold along the upper edges of walls. The higher sections of buildings receive brightness first. Painted surfaces start revealing their colours again. Red stripes, yellow sections, and the dark lines separating them emerge from the single uniform tone that night imposed on everything. Down in the courtyards, shadows grow shorter as the sun rises higher beyond the line of rooftops. The preparations for breakfast stay uncomplicated. Pieces of flatbread left over from the day before get warmed close to the fire. A small cooking pot goes over the flames with water and crushed grain inside it. The contents gradually thicken while being stirred with a wooden implement. Olives come out of a storage jar and get arranged in a dish with a shallow bowl. A wedge of cheese gets divided with a short blade, the portions determined by practiced judgment rather than measurement. These food items get set out without any formality or ritual. Children are moving through the rooms now, completely awake. One of them brings a small stool closer to where the fire burns. Another washes hands in a basin and uses the edge of a garment to dry them. Their voices stay quiet, not because they've been told to be silent, but because the hour itself encourages a subdued pace. A dog shifts position from where it slept near the entrance, extends its body in a stretch and makes one complete turn, and settles back down in a spot where light has just reached the threshold. From somewhere further along the street, the first distinct call of a vendor already moving through the neighborhood carries through the air. The voice steady and unhurried. The words follow a familiar pattern, advertising a commonly needed item. The sound moves along the stone surfaces and gradually fades. A door opens in response to the call. Someone steps out with a coin ready, trading it for a small package wrapped in cloth. The exchange happens quickly, hands meeting and separating without extended conversation. Water vessels get lifted and positioned against hips or balanced on shoulders. People begin heading toward the public fountains, some alone and others in pairs. Sandals create a soft scraping sound against the paving as they move. The street that was completely empty not long before now shows scattered activity. No large groups form. Each person follows a timing determined by what their household requires. When people pass each other, greetings get exchanged, brief and delivered in level tones. Inside the workshops that connect directly to living spaces, preparations are starting as well. A potter examines clay that's been kept covered with dampened cloth, pressing it once to check how firm it has become. A metal worker clears away items from a workbench surface, arranging tools in their proper sequence. These activities happen in near silence, with the focus required by the hands making speech unnecessary. Lines of smoke climb from several rooftops, narrow and vertical in the still air. The smell of bread being baked grows more pronounced coming from one particular direction, where a larger oven has already been put to use. The aroma spreads at a gradual pace, both recognizable and unremarkable. It doesn't announce anything special, just the beginning of production that will go on for many hours. Another faint tremor moves through, lighter than the vibration a cartwheel would make crossing rough stone. A small amount of dust particles fall from a ceiling beam in one of the interior rooms. The person standing beneath brushes them off a shoulder and goes back to tying a sandal strap. No shift in the pace of work follows this. Morning has completely established itself, and concentration stays fixed on the tasks requiring attention. Sunlight finally makes contact with the floor of the street, creating bright geometric shapes in the spaces between building shadows. The stone begins its slow warming process. Doorways stand in open positions. The number of voices increases, but their volume does not. The city makes its transition from stillness to movement in a measured, systematic way, with each household adding its own small collection of sounds that blend into a consistent background hum. The day has started in the same fashion as many that came before it, defined by light, by routine, and by the straightforward continuation of work that keeps daily life functioning. As the light gains more power, movement inside the houses becomes more organized and purposeful. The initial tasks have already been completed, and attention shifts toward maintaining order in the rooms themselves. A woman moves through the interior carrying a small basket, gathering up bits of ash, loose husks, and fragments left over from yesterday's activities. The basket sits against her hip as she bends down and straightens up in a repeating rhythm. The floor gets swept using bundled reeds, pushing fine dust particles toward the doorway where it can be sent out into the street to mix with the normal grit that comes from people passing. Close to the hearth, water that was heated earlier gets poured into a basin with shallow sides. Hands receive washing again, this time more slowly and with greater attention. A cloth goes into the water, gets wrung out, and then gets used to wipe down a table surface darkened from long use. The wood displays marks left by knives and bowls, each line something familiar that no longer gets noticed. Clay cups get placed in a line. A bowl of larger size goes in the center position, waiting to hold the morning porridge once it reaches the right consistency for serving. Grain that was crushed just a short time ago gets added into the pot. The mixture begins moving in slow circular patterns as the stirring continues. Steam starts to appear, barely visible at first. The smell remains mild and plain. A small pinch of salt gets taken from a dish and dropped into the pot. The motion shows careful measurement, neither rushed nor drawn out. The fire underneath stays at a low level, fed with short pieces of wood, placed with care to prevent sudden increases in flame. In a room off to the side, clothing that was worn during the previous day gets lifted and shaken one more time. Dust drops in a soft line toward the floor. A small tear at one sleeve edge gets examined. Then the fabric gets folded to hide it for mending later. Sandals receive inspection for straps that might have loosened. One gets tightened by pushing a small wooden peg deeper through the leather. This requires minimal attention, accomplished while listening to the quiet conversation happening in the main room. A boy carries a small jar toward the doorway, stopping there to observe the street now considerably brighter than it was earlier. Two people walk past, each one with a yoke resting across the shoulders and buckets hanging in balanced positions on both sides. The water inside the buckets moves with their steps, creating a dull sound that repeats regularly. The boy moves aside to give them room through the narrow opening, then continues on toward the fountain located at the end of the lane. The public fountains attract a small gathering of early visitors. The stone rim around the edge shows darkening from continuous contact. Water keeps flowing without pause from a carved opening dropping into the basin positioned below it. People wait without organizing themselves into a formal line, moving forward whenever space becomes available. Jars get set down on the ground filled with water and lifted again. A short greeting passes between neighbors who know each other by sound before they turn back toward their separate homes. Back in the interior, a small quantity of olive oil gets poured into a dish with a shallow bowl. Bread gets pulled apart by hand and dipped into the oil. The sound made when the crust separates is dry and soft. Pieces get passed from one person to another across the table. No one consumes food quickly. The meal represents the shift from preparation work to the outward movement of the day. A faint odor drifts down through the open roof space, sharper in character than wood smoke, but light enough to pass by without drawing comment. It combines with the usual sense of cooking and damp plaster. A woman stops what she's doing for a moment, looks up toward the open square of sky visible above, then goes back to her stirring. The smell becomes thinner and vanishes. In another house, situated close by, a girl kneels next to a storage jar that stands taller than her waist. She reaches down inside with a small scoop, bringing up dried beans that make a soft rattling sound as they drop into a bowl. The sound has a hollow quality and doesn't last long. She transports them to a bench where they'll soak in water later on. Her movements show deliberation, learned through doing the same task repeatedly, rather than through spoken instructions. The street outside continues growing brighter and more filled with activity. A cart moves past at a slow pace, its wooden wheels rotating with a steady creaking sound. The animal pulling it moves without visible effort, its head held low. The driver walks alongside rather than sitting on the cart, one hand placed on the edge for balance. What the cart carries consists of baskets stacked on top of each other and covered with cloth. Dust lifts lightly behind the turning wheels and drops back down. Inside the dwellings, doors stay in their open positions facing the street. Air moves through the rooms, making the edges of hanging cloth lift and fall. Light reaches the interior walls, bringing out painted borders and small decorative elements that were impossible to see an hour earlier. The colors take on warmth in the early sun, even though the air itself still carries a trace of the coolness that belonged to night. Dishes that were used for the meal get rinsed using a small amount of water and wiped down with cloth. Nothing gets left to soak in water. Surfaces get cleared to create space for work that will come later. A woman ties a cord around a bundle of greens that have been washed, getting ready to carry them to a neighbor in exchange for a handful of dried figs that were promised earlier in the week. This arrangement doesn't require anything written down to make it binding. A mild tremor passes through the ground one more time, so subtle it could be mistaken for a heavy footstep happening somewhere out of view. A ladle hanging on the wall taps once against the surface. Conversation stops for the length of one breath, then picks up again at the same level it was before. One person makes an adjustment to a jar so it sits more securely on a shelf. The adjustment represents the only response to the movement. Children step outside with more freedom now. One uses a stick to draw a line in the dust. Another watches an older sibling tie a cord around a bundle being prepared. Their voices go up and down in short bursts, never becoming loud enough to travel far. A dog crosses to the other side of the street, its nose held close to the ground, then finds a patch of shade cast by a doorway and settles there. In a courtyard at the rear of a house, laundry that was washed during the previous day gets checked. Fabric gets lifted down from a line and folded along straight edges. Each piece gets stacked in a neat pile and carried inside. The courtyard floor shows patches where water was thrown to keep dust settled. the moisture creates irregular shapes of darker stone that will fade away as the sun climbs to a higher position. A man makes preparations to leave for work that takes him beyond the boundaries of the house. He takes a small wrapped portion containing bread and olives, ties it into cloth, and fastens it at his belt. Before he steps out, he looks briefly toward the household shrine built into the wall. His hand moves to touch the edge of the niche, then drops away. The gesture happens quickly and follows a pattern established by habit. The sounds from the street now form a layer that continues without breaks. Footsteps, calls coming from a distance, the hollow ring produced when a metal tool gets struck once and then again. Smoke rising from hearths climbs in thin lines that begin to drift slightly as air starts moving with the warming of the day. The city has reached a fully awake state, though still within the early portion of morning when most tasks remain connected to the home. Inside, the last of the porridge gets spooned into bowls. The pot gets moved to the side, its retained heat saved for use later. Ash gets drawn carefully over the coals that remain to make their burning slower. The room carries smells of grain and warm clay. The meal comes to an end without any ceremony. Bowls get stacked together. A cloth wipes across the table one more time. The door opening to the street stays in its open position. Light floods the entryway, dropping across the floor in a shape that's bright and clearly defined. Outside, movement keeps building, but without any sense of rush. Each person moves the day forward through small actions done repeatedly. Actions that connect house to street and street to house in a flow that doesn't break. Along the street, shutters begin lifting in sequence, one after another, as wooden panels get pushed upward and locked into position to create narrow overhangs. This movement happens without any coordinating signal, with each shopkeeper responding to the same internal sense of light and the passage of time. Interior spaces that had been facing darkness now turn themselves toward the street, exposing counters that years of resting hands and exchanged goods have worn to a smooth finish. The distinction between living space and working area dissolves as doorways transform from barriers into points, where passage flows freely. The baker emerges first to inspect the oven that's built directly into the shop's front section. Heat retained from the fire that burned through the night still holds strong. He leans forward slightly, allowing the warmth to reach his face and the exposed skin of his forearms. A wooden peel sits close by, its surface carrying a light dusting of flour. Inside the oven, rounded loaves that were placed there earlier have expanded and started taking on color. He rotates one of them with a movement that's quick and practiced, then pulls back, content with the way the heat stays constant. The aroma of baking grain makes the air around the doorway thicker, moving down the street in a slow, gentle current. In the adjacent space, a cloth merchant brings folded lengths of fabric down from a shelf and positions them where sunlight can fall across them. Red fabrics, yellow ones, and pale wool that hasn't been dyed catch the sun from varying angles. He runs the flat of his hand over each piece, making sure the edges line up properly. A small collection of bronze weights gets arranged on the counter next to a balance scale. Stacked wax tablets lie within easy reach, their surfaces prepared to receive the marks that will track the day's exchanges. Some distance along, a metalworker opens his shutters with more deliberate slowness, since the work he does requires preparation to happen before customers begin arriving. He lowers himself to his knees near a small forge positioned against the wall at the back. Charcoal gets arranged with care, then stirred to reveal embers that were kept alive beneath the ash. A bellows sits at his side. Through pulls that are measured and controlled, he forces air into the coals. A glow begins forming, grows deeper, and starts to pulse in rhythm with each movement he makes. The subtle scent of metal being heated mingles with the broader smells of bread and smoke already present. In a workshop where fragments of stone cover the floor, a mason removes tools from a wooden container. Chisel, hammer, straight edge. Each one gets placed on a low bench following a sequence he knows by heart. He runs his thumb along the chisel's edge, checking how sharp it remains, then returns it to its position. A block that was partially shaped during the previous day stands waiting. Dust from the earlier work session forms a pale coating on the surface, something that will be disturbed again soon. Traffic moving through the street builds gradually to a denser level. People carrying baskets make their way between the open shop fronts, stopping when something they need catches their attention. No one raises their voice to call out. Transactions start with brief nods and phrases kept short. A woman comes to a stop at the baker's counter, sets down a coin, and takes possession of a small loaf wrapped in cloth. The exchange shows efficiency, with gestures that are nearly identical to the ones performed the day before, and on many days stretching back before that. A cart moves past at the speed of walking, its wheels making contact with the uneven stones and creating a dull, rhythmic sound. The driver keeps one hand positioned on the side, using it to guide the cart's path through the spaces that have narrowed because of open shutters. What the cart carries consists of clay vessels fitted inside one another, with straw cushioning their rims. The jars produce soft clinking sounds with each shift in weight, but stay secure in their arrangement. In the entrance of a small stall that sells food, a man sets out shallow dishes containing olives, nuts, and fruits that have been preserved. He makes adjustments to where they sit so that their colors provide contrast and the shapes look abundant. A jug filled with wine that's been diluted stands toward the back, a cloth covering it to keep insects from getting in. He uses a damp rag to wipe down the counter, then positions himself against the frame, observing the street as it reaches its full state of activity. Children move through the spaces between adults with the ease that comes from familiarity, knowing where to place their steps and when to pause. One of them carries a small bundle tied up in cloth, bringing it to a workshop located at the corner. The craftsman working inside accepts it without making any ceremony of the moment, sets it off to the side, and keeps scraping a surface smooth, using long strokes that stay even. The scraping sound creates a steady layer beneath the other noises building up in the street. A faint vibration travels through the paving stones, subtle enough that it gets felt more than it gets seen. A few objects hanging in place begin to sway for a moment. A tool belonging to the potter taps lightly where it hangs against the wall. The potter reaches out with one hand to steady it, then goes back to shaping a lump of clay on a low wheel. The clay rotates under his palms, rising bit by bit into a form that's symmetrical. His focus stays on the pressure his fingers apply and on how much moisture the material holds. Light has now pushed deeper into the street, bringing out textures on walls and at thresholds. Scratches, places where repairs were made, and patches of plaster that don't match the original reveal how long these buildings have been in use. Painted notices positioned near some doorways become possible to read, though few people stop to look at them during this hour. Attention stays directed at the tasks that bring the day's necessities within reach. At a point where streets intersect, a water cellar pauses with two large skins draped over a wooden frame. He lowers the frame to the ground with care and stretches his shoulders. Someone passing by approaches, holding a small cup, trades a coin for it, and drinks while standing in that spot. The seller lifts the frame again and moves forward, his steps measured in a way that keeps the weight distributed evenly. Inside a narrow shop dedicated to simple wooden items, a craftsman starts sanding the surface of a stool. Fine particles drop to the floor in a soft, continuous stream. He turns the piece around, checks the smoothness by pressing his palm against it, then continues the work. The repetitive motion produces a faint rasping sound that merges with the broader hum of activity filling the street. Voices stay at a level tone. Greetings get exchanged in short form without any display. A man inquires about the price of a tool, hears the answer, gives a nod, and moves along. Another person comes back to pick up an item that was left for repair, looks it over briefly, then tucks it under his arm. Each interaction takes up only a small fraction of time, yet when taken together, they create a continuous flow that keeps the street animated and active. Above, strips of cloth tied to windows on the upper levels shift slightly as air starts moving with the heat that's building. Shadows grow shorter and their edges become sharper. The coolness that belonged to early morning gives way to warmth that settles first on shoulders and on the tops of people's heads. Some shopkeepers make adjustments to where they stand, stepping back into shade while making sure their goods stay within view. From a distance, a low sound that rolls along comes through, passing beneath the ordinary clatter of wheels and voices. It fades quickly, creating no interruption in the movement around it. A man pauses only to shift a jar closer to the wall, making sure it sits in a secure position, then goes back to measuring grain into a customer's sack. The opening of shops reaches its completion. Tools have been placed where they're needed. Goods have been made visible. Fires are burning at stable levels. The street now operates as a workspace that extends across separate interiors, linking them into a single environment where exchange and labor happen. Nothing in the scene makes demands for attention beyond the immediate needs of trade and the routines that structure the day. The pace holds steady, shaped by habit and by the understanding everyone shares about how a day unfolds from beginning to end. The market area builds up activity in a way that's gradual and without force. Movement flowing from many streets comes together there, not in any rush, but in a steady merging of paths that habit has shaped. Stalls that were only frames an hour earlier now contain goods that have been arranged for display. Wooden tables stand on stones that aren't level, balanced when necessary with folded scraps of cloth tucked beneath one leg. Above, fabric that's been stretched overhead creates softened shade, moving slightly as air starts circulating with the day's warming. Farmers arriving from the countryside surrounding the city bring produce carried in baskets or slung across the backs of small animals. Greens still show traces of soil clinging near their roots. Figs sit in trays with shallow sides, their skins appearing dull and soft. Gourds that are long and pale lie next to bunches of onions tied together with fibre cord. The sellers position each item with care, rotating them so the best side faces outward. No one raises their voice to call out. Buyers move close enough that they can speak without needing to increase their volume. Those selling fish work near the edge where drainage channels cut shallow paths along the street. Their tables receive covering from damp cloth. Silver scales catch the light, throwing brief flashes as the fish get turned and arranged into position. A bucket of water stands ready for use. Hands dip into it, then pass over the display to keep the surfaces cool. The smell of the sea exists there but stays contained, blending with the sharper scent of herbs and with the warm dryness that comes from grain. Coins move from hand to hand with minimal counting involved. Weights and measures handle small differences that need settling. A woman picks up a bundle of greens, tests how firm the stems are, and gives a single nod. The seller adds a few extra leaves without making any comment, a gesture that balances earlier exchanges conducted in similar fashion. The goods get wrapped in cloth and placed into a basket that's already partly filled with other items. Children come along with adults, carrying lighter items or holding the edges of garments to avoid getting separated in the movement. They observe the motion of hands, the transfer of goods, learning the order that governs this place through what they see. One stops to look at a tray holding dates, then gets guided forward with a light touch at the shoulder. At a stall selling grain, a man pours wheat from a sack into a container used for measuring. The grain creates a steady stream, hitting the bottom with a dry sound that continues without break. When the measure reaches full, he levels it using a flat piece of wood and empties it into the bag the customer brought. A small cloud of dust lifts into the air, made visible by the angled light, then drops down onto surfaces nearby. Water from a public fountain positioned close by splashes without pausing. People step out of the market's flow to fill jars. The basin's edge shows smoothness from years of hands making contact. Drops fall onto the stones below, creating a dark patch that spreads and then fades slowly as the sun reaches across it. The sound the water makes becomes part of the background, neither pulling attention nor disappearing entirely. A mule stands with patience near a post, its head lowered, shifting weight from one leg to the other. Its load, 2 baskets containing pottery, stays balanced. Every so often, the animal flicks an ear or moves its tail, responding to flies that the mix of scents has drawn. The owner makes an adjustment to a strap, checks that the knot holds, and returns to speaking with a customer who's examining a small oil lamp. The light builds in strength, pushing beneath awnings and falling on faces from above. Lines at the corners of eyes and along foreheads become more clearly defined. Some people lift a hand briefly to block their sight while they inspect goods. Others take a step back into shade before they continue making their choices. A faint tremor moves through the ground, subtle but experienced by everyone. Items hanging in place begin to sway slightly. A string holding garlic bulbs, a strip of cloth, the handle of a scale. One seller places a palm against a jar to steady it, then takes the hand away once it rests without movement. Conversation keeps going without any change in tone. The tremor leaves nothing visible behind, except for a few grains of dust that got shaken loose from a folded cloth. The soundscape becomes thicker. Sandals create scraping sounds. Fabric produces rustling. A knife strikes a wooden board in a rhythm that stays steady as a vendor cuts portions of cheese. The pieces get wrapped in leaves and passed across to waiting hands. Close by, a woman crushes dried herbs between her fingers to release their scent so a buyer can judge them. The fragrance spreads for a short time, sharp and clean in quality. At the market's edge, a man works on repairing a basket while he waits for his wife to complete her purchases. He threads a new strip of reed through the weave that's already there, pulling it tight with strength that practice has developed. The motion repeats itself and stays precise. Bits of reed that get trimmed away fall at his feet, creating a small pile that will be gathered later. Overhead, the sky shows clarity, its color growing deeper as the sun makes its climb. The warmth has now settled fully on stone that's exposed. People make slight adjustments to their pace, not slowing in what they intend, but allowing their movements to lengthen. A sip of water gets taken before continuing forward. A bundle gets shifted from one arm to the other. Trade keeps going in this balanced manner. No single exchange draws attention away from others. Each small action, choosing, weighing, paying, packing, contributes to a pattern that gets repeated daily. The market doesn't swell suddenly or empty itself quickly. It maintains a steady level of presence, shaped by what households need and by the rhythm of work that will follow. From somewhere beyond the streets that are visible comes a low, distant sound that blends with the rolling of carts and with the murmur of voices. It stays for a moment, then fades away. No one turns toward it. Attention holds on the goods in hand, on the coins being counted, on the path through the stalls. As morning moves forward toward midday, baskets become heavier and tables become lighter. Sellers shift what remains closer together, maintaining displays that still look full. Buyers begin turning back toward the streets that lead home, their steps measured by the weight they're carrying. The market continues, but its center of motion slowly redistributes outward, flowing back into the network of lanes and doorways from which the people first came. Work finds its sustained rhythm as the middle portion of the day draws closer. The movement that filled the market disperses into streets that are narrower and into enclosed spaces where tasks continue out of view from the main flow. The character of sounds changes. The layered murmur that came from buying and selling gives way to motions that repeat themselves and serve a purpose. Motions that hold steady over long stretches of time. In the shop, where a metal worker practices his trade, the forge now burns at its full strength. Charcoal glows in a deep bed-colored orange beneath a skin of grey ash. Each time the bellows gets pulled, air feeds into the coals, and the brightness grows more intense briefly before returning to a glow that stays constant. A bar of iron sits in the heat, its darker surface beginning a slow shift toward red. The worker watches the color more than he watches the shape, judging when the moment arrives to lift it free. When he does, the metal makes contact with the anvil through a strike that's measured. The sound rings out once, clean and contained, then comes again in a slower sequence as the shape starts changing under blows that stay controlled. On the other side of the room, a smaller tool lies ready in a row alongside others that have similar form. Handles face outward for easy reaching. The floor beneath the anvil displays a scatter of dark flakes from hammering done earlier. These get brushed aside every so often with the side of a sandal, clearing space without breaking the pattern of work. Further along the street, a potter rotates a low wheel with one foot, while both hands guide the clay positioned above. The wheel's motion stays smooth and unbroken. Moisture from a small bowl at his side keeps the surface in a workable state. The clay rises between his palms, getting narrower, then widening as the need requires. He doesn't shift his gaze away from the form, except when he needs to wet his fingers. Completed vessels stand lined up against the wall, their surfaces dull as they wait to dry before facing the fire. In a space where carpentry happens, open to the street, wood shavings curl away from a plank under the draw of a blade. The craftsman pulls the tool toward himself in strokes that are long, each pass making the surface thinner and evening out the grain. The scent of fresh wood combines with the warmer smells of dust and stone warmed by sunlight. A stool under repair sits upside down nearby, one leg removed and placed beside it. Pegs and wedges lie sorted according to size in a tray with shallow sides. Labourers make their way through these spaces carrying materials that create links from one trade to another. A man brings a bundle of split wood to the baker, stacking it in a neat arrangement against the wall where it will stay dry. Another carries a sack holding crushed mineral pigment to a painter working inside a room that's shaded. The sack leaves a faint trail of coloured dust on the stone in places where it brushes the ground. In a courtyard workshop positioned behind a house, two women sit across from each other with a loom stretched between beams that stand upright. Threads run tight and parallel. One of them passes the shuttle through, the other makes adjustments to the tension, and the fabric that's growing advances by small amounts. Their movements stay synchronized without any discussion needed, shaped by practice that's been long. The only sound comes from the soft tap of wood against thread, and from the faint rustle as fibers settle into their place. Outside, the sun has now climbed high enough that shade pulls back toward walls and overhangs. Workers make shifts in their positions to keep tools and materials out of light that's direct. A jar of water stands within reach in nearly every workspace. Every so often, someone stops to drink, wiping the jar's mouth with the back of a hand before placing it down again. A faint vibration makes contact with the ground, subtle and brief in duration. In one shop, a scale that's been suspended begins to sway slightly, its pans tapping together one time. The merchant reaches out with 2 fingers to steady them and checks that the weights stay in their place. Finding nothing out of order, he goes back to marking figures into the soft surface of a wax tablet, the stylus making movements in short, deliberate lines. Voices appear fewer here than they did in the market, and the ones that do rise stay at a low level. Instructions get delivered in single phrases. Requests for a tool or material receive answers through a gesture toward where it sits. Much of the communication takes place through shared awareness of the work itself. Each person knows where to position themselves to avoid blocking another's movement. Dust hangs suspended in the air where stone is receiving shape. A mason strikes along a line that's been marked, with chips falling away in small bursts. He pauses to brush the surface clean, looks at the edge, then continues. The block takes on a more regular form slowly, with corners defined by patient repetition rather than through force. Animals make their contribution to the working day. A donkey stands tethered in a corner that's shaded, shifting only to reach a small pile of feed that's been placed within range. Its ears move in response to the ring of hammer on metal, then settle back. Flies gather and break apart, driven away by the occasional sweep of a tail. The flow of time here gets measured less by where the sun sits than by stages of completion that get reached. A tool head arrives at its final curve. A pot joins the row that's waiting to dry. A plank lies smooth where it carried roughness before. These changes build up quietly, marking progress without making announcements. From beyond the cluster where workshops group together comes a low, distant sound that rolls once through the air and fades. A worker pauses only long enough to send a glance toward the street, then bends again over his task. The sound merges with the ongoing rhythm of labor, becoming indistinguishable in meaning from the many other noises that get carried across the city. Heat gathers on the stones outside, but inside, the work keeps going at a pace that stays even. The middle hours of the day don't bring stillness, only a narrowing of where focus goes. Each trade maintains its place within the larger pattern, contributing goods and repairs that sustain households beyond these walls. The steady exchange between effort and result continues without emphasis, forming the core of what the day's activity consists of. Public spaces contain a different kind of movement than what happens in the workshops and market. Here, people arrive carrying not only goods or tools, but also the small pauses that fit between tasks that take longer. Paths from several streets come together at open areas where fountains, benches, and edges that offer shade create places where stopping doesn't block passage. The pace shows measurement, neither rushed nor idle in character. At a fountain basin that's broad, water spills continuously from a spout that's been carved, falling into the stone trough positioned below. The surface sends ripples outward in rings that stay steady. Individuals approach, lower their jars to the ground, and fill them in turn. Some pause to rinse dust from hands or forearms, allowing droplets to fall back into the basin. The stone edge feels cool to the touch in places where water has darkened it. The sound of splashing combines with conversation kept low. Close by, a pair of men stand beneath shade, provided by a walkway with columns. One holds a small wax tablet, while the other points with a fingertip, discussing figures that have been marked into the surface. Their voices stay even in tone. When the discussion reaches its end, the tablet gets closed and tucked into a fold of cloth. They separate without ceremony, each one turning toward a street that's different. Steps lead downward into a bathing complex where the air undergoes change at once. Moisture clings to the walls, and the smell of warm water and stone takes the place of the dryness that belongs to the street. Those entering carry small bundles containing cloths and flasks of oil. Sandals get removed near the entrance and left in rows that show order. Inside, movement slows further. Conversations keep going, but sound gets softened by the space being enclosed. In the area for changing, garments receive folding and get set aside. Skin meets the warm air and shoulders release their tension. A man pours a small quantity of oil into his palm and spreads it across an arm before stepping toward the room that's been heated. Others sit along the wall, speaking quietly while they wait for their turn. The routine shows familiarity, part of the regular care given to the body, rather than something set apart from the day. Back outside, in a square where sunlight falls, a woman pauses beside a low wall to make adjustments to the strap of a basket. The basket contains bread, greens, and a small wrapped portion of cheese. She shifts the weight from one hip to the other, then continues toward a side street. A child walks beside her, carrying a bundle that's smaller and watching the movement of pigeons pecking at grain scattered on the stones. Under an awning, two older men sit on a bench that years of use have worn smooth. One traces a line in the dust using a stick, while the other watches the street. Their talk moves slowly, with long intervals of quiet, marking it. They observe those passing every so often, raising a hand in greeting without getting up from where they sit. A mild tremor travels through the ground, subtle enough that only the water's surface at the fountain reveals it clearly. The ripples shift for a moment, then go back to their regular pattern. A woman steadying her jar, takes notice of the movement and holds it still until the water becomes calm. She lifts it and leaves, her pace unchanged. Vendors make their way through these open spaces as well, carrying trays that cords around their necks keep suspended. They offer small portions of food that's ready to eat, olives, bread that's been dipped in sauce, slices of fruit. Buyers stop briefly, trade a coin, and keep walking while they eat. Crumbs fall and get found quickly by birds that follow at a distance that's cautious. Light bounces off pale walls and off the surfaces of water, bringing brightness to faces and garments. Those who stay longer make shifts closer to shade, following the slow arc of shadow that buildings and columns cast. The heat doesn't bring activity to a stop, but it pulls it inward, toward edges and spaces that have covering. At the entrance to a side street, a man waits beside a public notice that's been painted onto the wall. He runs a hand over the surface, smoothing an edge where the plaster has broken away. After a moment, he turns away and walks toward a workshop carrying a piece of cloth rolled up under his arm. The sounds here show difference from the sharper tones that labor produces. Footsteps create echoes that spread more widely across open stone. Water, voices, and the occasional scrape of a bench leg form the main layer. No single sound takes dominance. The space absorbs and releases movement in equal measure, acting as a place of passage as much as it acts as a place of pause. From beyond the roofs that are visible comes a low, distant rumble that blends with the ordinary noise belonging to the city. A few heads tilt slightly, then return to their previous positions. The rumble fades, leaving behind the steady presence of water and quiet speech. As the middle of the day keeps going, these public spaces maintain a flow that's balanced. People arrive, rest briefly, attend to needs that are small, and leave. The rhythm stays even, shaped by the understanding everyone shares about time and necessity. Nothing gathers long enough to create a crowd. Nothing disperses suddenly. The open areas hold the city's motion gently, then release it back into the streets and homes from which it came. The day reaches its highest point, bringing change not to purpose, but to the pace at which things move. The sun occupies a position directly overhead, and light drops straight down into streets that held shade during earlier hours. Stone surfaces begin releasing warmth into the air, which creates a stillness that spreads across all movement. Activity keeps going, yet every action extends itself slightly, influenced by the heat rather than by any sense of urgency. In the workshops, doors stay in their open positions, but workers make adjustments to where they stand to remain at the edges of shadow. A metal worker pulls his anvil a short distance back from the threshold, where sunlight had started reaching it. He draws his forearm across his brow, leaving behind a faint streak of charcoal dust, then returns to shaping a strip of metal that's narrow. The strikes his hammer makes arrive at intervals that are wider, both measured and controlled. At the bench where a carpenter works, a frame that's half finished sits untouched for a moment, while the craftsman takes a drink from a small cup. He pours water slowly from a jar, taking care not to let any go to waste. After drinking, he rinses his mouth and spits onto the dry ground outside, where the dark spot fades with speed. He goes back to his work, placing the blade against wood one more time. Movement through the street becomes slightly thinner. Those who have to travel do so by staying close to walls where shade still exists. A woman carrying a basket comes to a stop beneath an overhang, lowering it to the ground to rest her arms. She makes adjustments to the cloth covering the food inside, checks that nothing has shifted from its place, then lifts it again and moves forward at the same steady pace she kept before. In the homes, the midday meal gets prepared in quantities that are smaller than what the evening one will require. Bread left over from earlier gets softened with water or dipped in oil. Vegetables purchased earlier, now cold, get set out. A pot that was warmed earlier in the morning gets brought back to the edge of the coals, stirred one time and served. The eating happens indoors, where the air moves more slowly and where light doesn't fall as directly. Children who had been playing in open spaces earlier now position themselves along thresholds or in courtyards where shade covers most of the floor. One uses a fingertip to trace patterns in dust. Another leans against a wall, observing an older sibling tie a cord around a bundle of reeds. Their voices stay low, shaped by the quiet that belongs to this hour. Animals show similar responses. A dog that had followed its owner through the market now lies stretched on its side in a strip of shadow that's narrow, breathing with evenness. A donkey flicks its ears and drops its head lower, conserving any movement. Birds collect near water sources, hopping closer to the fountain's edge where the air carries more coolness. A faint scent that's unfamiliar passes briefly through a street, something noticeable only in places where air currents shift between buildings. It doesn't stay long. A man stepping from a doorway stops for a moment, sends a glance upward toward the open sky, then continues walking, his attention going back to the parcel in his hands. Inside a room where weaving happens, the loom stands without movement for a short while. The two women who worked it during earlier hours sit back, their hands resting in their laps. One takes a drink from a cup, while the other makes adjustments to the cloth covering her shoulders. After a few moments pass, they lean forward again, guiding the shuttle through the threads with precision. that's unhurried. A mild tremor makes contact with the ground. So light, it feels like a heavy cart passing somewhere beyond what can be seen. A stack of wooden bowls produces a rattling sound once against the wall where they hang. A hand reaches to steady them, then drops away. No one offers any words about it. The moment passes into the broader stillness surrounding it. Public fountains keep drawing visitors who arrive quietly. Water splashes with the same steady sound it made before, but fewer people collect at once. Those who come fill their jars quickly and move along. A man washes his face, allowing water to drip from his beard before wiping it away with a cloth. He stands for a moment longer in the shade, then steps back into the light. The market area displays gaps in places where tables had been fuller during earlier hours. Goods that remain get pulled closer together to keep order maintained. Sellers sit positioned behind their displays rather than standing, watching the slow passage of potential buyers. Transactions continue to occur, but with pauses that last longer between them. Air carries a blend of stone that's been warmed, smoke that's faint, and the ordinary smells that food produces. Shadows stay short, clustered tightly against walls and beneath the awnings. The brightness works to soften edges and reduce contrast, giving the streets a tone that's uniform and that quiets the appearance of movement. Work doesn't come to an end, but it narrows to what has to be done before the day starts to cool. Repairs reach their completion. Orders that were promised for the afternoon get finished. Tools get set aside one by one when a task arrives at its natural end. Each person makes a judgment about effort against the heat, without speaking of it. From far beyond where the city's buildings stand comes a sound that's low, brief, and distant, merging with the background that belongs to the day. No heads turn now. The sound passes the way other sounds do, absorbed into the ongoing presence of work, rest, and small exchanges that keep going without interruption. The city makes its way through this warm interval in a state of quiet that's measured. Activity continues to exist, but gently, held within the boundaries that sun and stone have set. The rhythm slows without coming to a stop, preserving energy for the hours when light will soften and movement will gather itself again. As the sun makes its descent, light pulls away from the center of the streets and collects along the upper walls before fading there as well. The heat that stone held begins to ease. Air that had felt still through the midday hours moves again in currents that are slow between buildings. People who stayed indoors during the hours of brightest light step back into the lanes, their pace unhurried, their attention shifting toward the close of work and the preparation that the evening meal requires. Shops that stayed open through the heat now start to change their arrangement. Goods get drawn back from the street's edge. Lengths of fabric receive folding and get stacked. Tools receive wiping with cloth and get placed into wooden chests. A metal worker spreads ash across the surface of his coals to make their burn slower through the night. The glow undergoes a gradual dimming. He stands for a moment observing the colour fade, then turns to hang his hammer on its peg. In the houses, hearths receive stirring back to life. Embers that were preserved beneath ash get uncovered and fed with small pieces of wood. Flames climb without smoke at first, then find their way to a steady burn. Clay pots get set into their place. Water that was carried earlier from the fountain gets poured in amounts that are measured. Lentils or beans that have soaked since morning get added, along with herbs and a small measure of oil. The pot undergoes quiet simmering, its surface moving in circles that are slow. Bread from earlier gets broken into pieces and placed in bowls with shallow sides. Some of it gets dipped into the cooking pot to make it softer. A handful of olives receives pouring onto a plate. A knife passes from one hand to another to divide a piece of cheese into portions that are equal. No single person takes charge of directing the process. Each movement fits into the others through familiarity that's been established. Doorways stay in their open positions facing the street, allowing the air that's cooler to pass through the interior rooms. Voices travel more easily now, drifting between houses that neighbour each other. Greetings get exchanged across thresholds. A woman stops with a bowl in her hands to speak briefly with someone passing, then returns inside before the food loses its heat. Children move in and out, getting called back when the meal reaches readiness. Hands receive rinsing in a basin near the entrance. Water splashes onto the floor and gets wiped aside with a cloth. A small stool gets drawn closer to where the hearth burns. A dog waits near the doorway, watching the activity without making an entrance. Light inside makes a shift from natural to lamplight. Small clay lamps receive filling with oil and get fitted with wicks that are fresh. One by one, they receive lighting from the hearth flame. The glow stays steady and low, spreading across walls in pools that are soft. Shadows take form behind jars and furniture, moving slightly as people make their passage. In the street, carts make their final passages. Wheels produce sounds that are duller now against stone that's cooling. A man carries a bundle of reeds on his shoulder, making his way home. Another leads a donkey with baskets that are empty, the load having been delivered earlier in the day. Dust that gets stirred by their steps settles quickly in the air that's calmer. A faint tremor travels through the ground, gentle and brief in nature. Liquid in a lamp trembles along the edge before becoming still. A woman reaches to steady the lamp, then keeps serving food into bowls. The moment passes without anyone remarking on it. People position themselves close together as they eat, not in silence, but in conversation that's low and that rises and falls evenly. The meal shows simplicity and provides filling. Steam lifts from bowls and disappears into the dim air positioned above. The smell of legumes that have been cooked and bread that's warm blends with oil and faint smoke from the hearth. After the eating ends, bowls receive wiping clean with pieces of bread. Dishes get stacked and set aside for washing later. A cup of wine that's been watered gets shared between two people, passed from hand to hand. Outside, the sky makes a shift toward blue that's deeper. The outlines of buildings undergo softening as daylight leaves them. Along the street, shutters start to lower. Wooden panels come down and receive securing with bars from inside. The open view into shops undergoes narrowing and then disappears. Light stays visible through windows on upper levels and through roof openings, marking where families still sit in a wakeful state. The pace of movement undergoes slowing again, not from heat now, but from the natural close that belongs to the day. Those who step outside do so briefly, to empty a basin or speak a final word with a neighbor. Footsteps create echoes more clearly in the activity that's thinning. From beyond the rooftops comes a sound that's low and distant, rolling once and fading. A man standing in his doorway comes to a pause, listening only long enough to mark its passing, then turns back inside. Lamps keep their glow going. Hearth fires find their way to steady coals. Evening gathers itself without ceremony. Work has reached its end. Meals receive sharing. The city moves inward, from street to house, from space that's open to rooms that are enclosed, where voices soften and tasks give way to rest. Night moves further into position, and the last color drains away from the sky above the rooftops. What stays is the steady glow of lamps within homes, and the faint wash of moonlight in places where it reaches open courtyards. The streets no longer carry the sounds that were layered from trade and work. Instead, they contain scattered movements that are isolated, movements that pass and fade without drawing attention. Inside the houses, the evening meal has reached its end. Bowls and cups receive rinsing with small amounts of water and get wiped dry with cloths that use has worn thin. Food that's left over receives covering and gets set aside in corners that are cool. A pot still carrying warmth from the hearth gets moved away from heat that's direct. Ash receives drawing over the embers to preserve a trace of warmth for morning. Voices stay present but take on a lower quality now, shaped by rooms that are enclosed and by the nearness of rest. A man sits on a stool near the doorway, working to repair a strap that frayed during the day. His hands move following habit, guiding a needle through leather with pulls that are slow and firm. Across from where he sits, a woman folds a garment along its seams and places it atop a small chest. Each action works to prepare the house for the next day without urgency driving it. Children become quieter. One leans against a wall, head beginning to nod, before receiving guidance toward bedding that's been laid out along the side of a room. Cloths receive unrolling and get spread across the floor or low frames. A hand smooths the surface one time, then pulls away. A lamp receives turning slightly away to make its light dimmer. Outside, a final cart makes its passage along the main street, its wheels producing a hollow sound in the space that's open. The driver's figure amounts to little more than a dark shape moving through the dimness. When the sound undergoes fading, stillness makes its return, broken only by the occasional step of someone crossing from one doorway to another. A breeze that's faint moves through the lanes, carrying the smell of stone that's cooling and smoke from distant hearths. Shutters, now in their closed positions, block most of the interior light from making contact with the street. Only narrow lines of glow show at the edges where wood meets plaster. A mild tremor makes contact with the ground, so light that it feels like the earth settling after the warmth of the day. A chain holding a lamp hanging sways one time, then stops. In one house, a cup that was left near the edge of a table undergoes a slight shift. A hand reaches out, moves it farther from the edge, and the hand returns to rest. Animals reach their fully settled state. A dog makes one circle before lying down near a doorway, head positioned on paws. Somewhere further along the street, a donkey shifts its weight and releases breath. The sound brief and soft. Birds that had made nests in roof spaces tuck themselves deeper beneath tiles. In a courtyard that's open to the sky, a woman pours a final basin of water across the stone to settle dust before the night arrives. The water spreads in a shape that's dark and that reflects the small square of stars positioned above. She stands a moment, looking upward without showing expression, then turns back inside, pulling the door into its closed position behind her. Lamps receive extinguishing one by one. Each wick gets pinched or covered, sending up a thread of smoke that's thin, that curls and disappears. Rooms undergo dimming to the faintest glow, then to darkness. Only embers in hearths provide a light that's low and red, barely something visible. The sounds belonging to the city narrow to the smallest range. A cough from within a house, the rustle of cloth as someone shifts position, the distant drip of water from a fountain that never stops. Footsteps no longer make passage in the street. The spaces that are open hold only shadow and air that's cooling. From far beyond the walls comes a murmur that's low and distant, rolling through the night and fading. It doesn't create disturbance to rest. It blends with the memory of daytime noise that's now gone. The city stays settled, each household enclosed within quiet that belongs to it. Night keeps deepening, drawing a calm that's steady over stone, wood and tile. The movement that filled the day has pulled itself into forms that are still and at rest. Lamps have gone out. Doors have received barring. The air undergoes further cooling, and the quiet that's ordinary to the city holds without undergoing change. The night arrives at its deepest point, without any boundary that's clear marking the moment. Darkness sits evenly across rooftops, courtyards and streets. The warmth that walls and paving stones stored has become thinner, leaving air that feels cool where it makes contact with exposed skin. No lamps stay lit in the parts of the houses that are open. Only the faintest glow from embers that are covered shows briefly when a draught moves through a hearth and then disappears again. Inside the rooms, people lie on their sides or backs, wrapped in coverings that are light. Breathing moves slowly and evenly. A sleeper undergoes a shift in position, cloth rustling softly, then becomes still again. A hand rests near the edge of a bed frame that's low, fingers showing relaxation. In another room, a child produces a murmur once in sleep and quiets without waking. Doors stay in their secured positions. Wooden bars sit firm in the brackets that hold them. Curtains that hang across interior spaces move slightly as air makes its passage through roof openings. The movement shows gentleness without producing sound. Shadows maintain their places along walls, shaped by moonlight in places where it reaches, and by the faint outline of starlight above courtyards that are open. The streets show emptiness of footsteps. The stones that are worn appear pale in the light that's dim, their surfaces marked by the day's passage, yet undisturbed now. At a fountain, water keeps up its steady fall into the basin. The splash takes on softness at night, echoing lightly between the buildings. A line of moisture that's thin trails away along the channel, catching a small glimmer from the sky. Animals stay in their settled state. A dog lifts its head one time, ears turning toward a sound that's distant, then lowers it again to rest on its paws. Birds tucked beneath roof tiles undergo slight shifting, feathers brushing against clay. An animal that's tethered releases breath, which becomes visible for a moment in the air that's cooler before fading. A faint tremor travels through the ground, lighter than a footstep would be. A cord that's suspended near a doorway sways one time, then becomes still. Dust loosens from a beam and drifts downward in a line that's thin, settling on the floor without being noticed. The structure of the house maintains its hold as before. Nothing undergoes alteration beyond these small motions. From far beyond the city, a murmur that's low and distant rolls through the darkness. It stays for a few breaths, then fades into the larger quiet. No one undergoes waking. The sound makes its passage the way other night sounds do, without drawing notice or meaning. Sky that's cloudless spans above, stars fixed in the patterns that belong to them. The squares that are open in courtyards frame small portions of that sky, bordered by the dark lines of roofs that are tiled. Air moves slowly downward from the heights and across surfaces of stone, carrying away the last warmth that belongs to the day. Within one house, a pot that was left near the hearth releases a final trace of warmth into the room. The clay undergoes gradual cooling. A stool made of wood stands where it received setting after the evening meal, untouched. A garment that's been folded rests on a chest, edges showing alignment. Tools that hang on a wall stay in their places, outlines barely something visible. The city achieves full rest. No voices make their carrying, no work keeps going. The spaces that held movement and exchange now contain only forms that are still and the quiet presence of structures at rest. Water flows, air moves, and the ground maintains its steady hold beneath walls and roofs. Time makes its passage without measure. The night doesn't change in the character it holds. Calm stays spread evenly through houses, streets, and spaces that are open. The stillness that's ordinary to rest continues unmarked and complete.